A reading from the book of Psalms. Hear what God's words is saying. Hear what God's Spirit is saying to you. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Break forth into joyous song and sing praises. Sing praises to the Lord with the lyre and the sound of the melody. With trumpets and the sound of the horn, make a joyful noise before the King, the Lord. Here ends the reading of the words that give us insight on God. May God grant us with wisdom and courage for interpretation.
Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.
Friends, will you pray with me? Holy and loving God, hear our shouts of joy and also our wails of sorrow. May it come together as one loud roar of hope. And now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each and every one of our hearts be pleasing to you and acceptable in your sight, O God, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Whenever Shauna lived in New York City and I was finishing my last year of seminary, one of our favorite things to do was to spend the weekend together in the city visiting churches. I know that's not everyone's idea of a good time, but we enjoyed doing that, which is one of the ways that I knew that I had chosen the right partner, because I know that not everyone would put up with that. But we enjoyed doing it, I think in large part because we knew that after that year, I would be spending every Sunday with the same congregation, and it was an opportunity to experience a diversity of faith. And so we would go around and make it a bit of an adventure. I remember one time in particular, a memory that I was sharing at Coffee Chat a couple of weeks ago, when we went to St. John the Divine Cathedral on the Upper West Side. Beautiful cathedral. And actually we'd gone to a midday service in the middle of the week, and we found the little side chapel where the service was being held. And we pulled out the Book of Common Prayer and we kind of fumbled along as we tried to follow the service. And then it came time for communion. And this was in a tradition where you would go and you would kneel at the altar. So we went and we knelt at the altar, and the priest came along and placed a wafer on each person's tongue, and then came along with the common cup. And as I was drinking from the common cup, I realized that I had neglected to mention to my former Southern Baptist wife that was going to be wine. And as she drank from the common cup, it was clear that she discovered it for herself, because she looked at the priest and just made this disgusted face. A face I almost made this morning when I realized that this grape juice had fermented a little bit. We're not keeping that as fresh as we used to. I need to go out and get new grape juice. It was always a bit of an adventure to go and explore new congregations, but there was something that almost always caught us off guard. And it was something that never should have, because it was the same in every single congregation. The offering. The offering. We would always be sitting there and thinking, how did we forget about the offering? And whenever it came time, we would pull out our wallets and we would look at them and realize that we hadn't gotten any cash. Even back then, we lived in a plastic world, just our cards, and this was before the days when every church had online giving, and so we recognized that we were not going to be giving that day. And as the deacon came along, we realized that we had to find a way to communicate that to the deacon. Would we just kind of look off into space or kind of bury our head? Or would we make a face or shake our head or put our hand out? It was awkward, as we were saying, we're not going to be giving this day. Talking about money is awkward, isn't it? And in our society, we've also been taught that it's impolite to talk much about finances. And I think the church often does a pretty poor job of thinking about finances. Often in the church, what we want to do is to relegate talking about financial issues to a certain portion of the year, our stewardship season, and then when it's over, we think, we got through that. We don't have to talk about that again until next year. I think it would often be better if we would think throughout the year about how everything that we have is a gift from God entrusted to us for its care, and that we have a responsibility to use it in God's world. And yet, this is a particularly weird year to think about finances and the future at all, isn't it? I mean, most of us haven't seen each other in person for months, since March or perhaps before. We don't know how long we're going to be apart, how long we're going to be online only, and we know that even when we are able to get back together, that things are going to be different. It's an odd time to think about the future because we don't know what the future is going to look like. Of course, we never really know what the future is going to look like, but we're especially aware of that this year. And yet, in the Psalms, and particularly in Psalm 98 that we're looking at over the course of this month, the psalmist encourages us to shout for joy and to be hopeful. One thing that I love about the Psalms is that they often envision within the Psalms all of creation singing for joy. Not just people, not even just animals making joyful noises, but all of creation. Hills and water, flowers and trees. Can you picture that? All of creation singing songs of praise to God. To be joyful. And yet it is an odd time to be joyful, isn't it? I was thinking about that this week, about how we're supposed to be joyful, about how we're supposed to sing to God during this time when it has seemed like so much has gone wrong and like so much has been unknown. How is it that we're joyful? How is it that we're hopeful during this time? And I was reminded of a story from the book of Ezra. Do you spend much time reading the book of Ezra? Well, you may remember I mentioned this last week that in 587 BCE, before the Common Era, the Babylonians came into the southern kingdom of Judah, where the capital city of Jerusalem was, and they conquered the entire southern kingdom. Then they took all the leaders and all the nobility, and they made them leave their home and live in Babylon in exile. And they destroyed the temple for good measure. They kept those leaders there not just for a few days or a few months or even a few years, but for almost 5 decades. 5 decades, can you imagine that? 5 decades of not seeing loved ones, 5 decades of not knowing how long it was going to go on, 5 decades of not knowing what was next. 5 decades. Then in 539, Cyrus the Great of Persia came along and conquered the Babylonians. And in 538, Cyrus allowed everyone to return to their homes. And they were filled with great joy, great hope, great expectation, because for the first time in 5 decades, they were able to return to the place that they loved. Ezra tells a story of what it was like to come home. One of the things that they decided to do right away was to rebuild the temple. They were going to build it grander than ever before. It was going to be even more spectacular, even more beautiful. And so, in the beginning of the book of Ezra, they start to build the temple, and the foundations have all been laid. And they decide to have a celebration. It's going to be spectacular. On the day of the celebration, the priests are all adorned in their finest vestments. There are trumpeters blasting out for joy. There are people with cymbals clanging together. and there are singers bellowing out their song. It is an incredible day. It's joyful, and the people begin to sing and to rejoice. And then something really odd happens. There's a whole other group of people that begins to wail. They're overcome with sorrow. Why would they be sorrowful on a day like that, a joyful day where things are beginning to return to normal? Well, we discovered that these are the folks who remembered what life had been like before. These were the folks who remembered the previous temple. The people who remembered the loved ones who had last stood around the foundations with them, whom they would never see again. And they began to wail. That feeling of mixed emotions, joy and hope, yet also sorrow and wailing, I imagine is something that we might be a little bit familiar with during this time. I hope that you are finding ways to discover joy, to be hopeful, and yet also realize that there is a lot that has probably felt overwhelming. If I had to choose one word to describe 2020, that's the word I would use: overwhelming. Have you felt overwhelmed this year with so much going on? I think about that even in terms of the church and things that are happening here. We have continued to do vital ministry during this time. We've continued to worship together to stay as connected as we can manage. We've continued to serve our community and our world, and yet we are disconnected, and we are sitting at this liminal time in our church's history. This month marks the 114th anniversary of University Christian Church. 114 years we have stood on the corner of Cleveland and Richmond and made a difference. And the church has changed many times, and we are on the precipice of something huge. We are installing solar panels to be more environmentally conscious. We are creating this building project where we're expanding our preschool, and we're increasing the collaboration of nonprofits in the community. We're providing affordable housing for seniors. We are creating a revitalized worship space and fellowship space for our community here, and yet there is so much that is unknown. And I imagine that at this time, we might be filled with both hope and excitement and a little bit of anxiety and maybe some sorrow as well. And I think that's all perfectly natural during this time. You know, in that story in Ezra, there's one group of people that is shouting for joy, and there's another group that is wailing with sorrow. I imagine even that group that's wailing with sorrow has some hope about the future. But the book says their voices blend together into one loud roar, so that at the end, you couldn't tell who was wailing and who was shouting for joy. It just sounded like one sound coming from the whole community. I imagine our prayer to God sounds a lot like that right now. A mix of emotions, a mix of wailing and shouting for joy. And yet the psalmist encourages us to cry out to God no matter what it is that we are feeling. To sing those songs, whether they are shouts of joy or wailing. May God hear those shouts and those wails together. May it be so. Amen.